Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight, Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah is most happy to present one of the foremost scholars in the field of Islamic art. He has produced an immense number of books and essays, including architectural studies ranging from Persian Mamluk architecture to list the completely, that's one, but to list the complete list of his accomplishments will definitely take up the time for his long-awaited lecture. But sufficient to say that they include many aspects of Islamic art, including a published study of the Kalila and Dumna manuscript, which was supported by Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. In addition, he has participated in exhibitions, conferences, and lectures in international cultural establishments and centers. Based in 1980 in the American University of Cairo, where he is a professor of Islamic art and architecture, he has served as visiting professor in such universities as Harvard and the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Bernard O'Kane is truly one of the best friends of the Dar and has participated in our lecture series. Summaries of his lectures have filled the pages of the Dar's publication, Hadith al-Dar, throughout the years and various seasons. The intriguing title of O'Kane's talk, Geometry, Art and Ideology in Fatimid, Zangid and Ayyubid, Egypt and Syria, promises to consider a controversial new considered topic involving an underlying dispute that is currently being debated. A constantly changing geometry and design is what you regularly hold in your hand, and you call it mobile. Please turn them off and let's welcome Professor O'Kane.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be back here at the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah to give a talk and to meet everybody again. The two images that you see in the screen, at first sight might look a little bit similar in terms of their complexity, but if you have a look more carefully at the one on the left, which is from the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, dating from the 9th century, the component parts of it are made of basically hexagons. And it's a very simple repeating pattern, at least compared to the one on the right-hand side, which is from many centuries later, the Maqam Ibrahim in the citadel in Aleppo, dating from 1168. And it has, what to me at least is an incredibly complicated pattern where you have 11 pointed stars, alternating with 12-pointed and with 10-pointed stars. So how did we get from one to the other? Well, this is partially what I'm going to be talking about today. The development of the study of geometric patterns in Islamic art is kind of a hot topic recently. And one of the most comprehensive works on it is this one by J. Bonner, which has come out recently, which studies the development of the whole field. You might notice that the foreword by this is by Sir Roger Penrose, not a familiar name to anybody interested in Islamic art, but he is an extremely well-known mathematician. And in fact, J. Bonner comes to the subject also from a mathematical background. And the controversy that was mentioned in the introduction is one that is still ongoing in the Islamic world. It was raised, first of all, by Professor Nejibolo in a wonderful book which was a publication of a very important scroll in the Topkapi Sarai. But in conjunction with this, she argued that the use of geometric patterning was much more common in the Seljuk successor states to the Abbasids, and basically showed allegiance to these political entities, and was much less common for ideological reasons in the Fatimids, who she claimed used foliate decoration in much greater numbers. And her arguments were taken up chiefly by Yasser Tabah in several publications. Some other scholars, Jonathan Bloom, Terry Allen, myself, have argued against these. Today I'm going to revisit some of the material used in these arguments and to bring some new material to bear upon the argument as well, I hope. Now, as I mentioned, the basis for the discussion of the development of patterns in Jay Bonner's book, it's very comprehensive, it's very impressive. It's also very mathematical, which can be a little bit of a problem for many lay viewers. For instance, one of the patterns that we're going to see repeated in several times in Fatimid monuments, including the wonderful portable mihrab that we have from the Sayyid Ruqayya Mashhad in Cairo. It's now in the Islamic Museum. I'll show it later. He described it, for instance, as, well, this geometric figure. It looks like a complicated mathematical equation. If you know, in fact, that in describing what's called tessellation or tiling, tessellation, it's the word just for a tiling pattern, and since it sounds very complicated and mathematical, I'm going to use it to make me sound more competent. So he uses 3, 4 simply means 3 repeated 4 times in this case. It's not a mathematical equation, really. So that is 3 repeated 3 times, 4 twice, 3 twice, etc. I first gave a version of this paper at a conference on mathematical symmetry in art in Japan, where it was attended by mostly mathematicians. And I showed them this kind of analysis, and most of them, frankly, didn't have a clue what it meant. So if they don't know, I think we can be excused as well for not knowing what the exact mathematical underpinnings are. But I'm going to try and keep it simple for the most part. So back to the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, where already in pre-Fatimid times in the 9th century, we have some quite impressive examples of geometric design in Islamic art. This, of course, is a monument which was built very much borrowing from the Abbasid style in Samarra at the time. That includes the design on the spandrels of the arches around the courtyard, one of which you see here. It's not a very complicated geometrical design, although it is interesting in that, unlike most of the others, it's not symmetrical around a vertical axis. But we do have some other window grills. There's a very extensive series of window grills. Most of these are later. They date from a Mamluk refaction of the mosque in 1298. But there are a couple which again are based mainly on the hexagonal tessellation that I showed you earlier, including this one, which looks a bit more complicated but can easily be made with a ruler and a compass. And these are the ones that Creswell, for instance, who studied the mosque originally in great detail, thought might be the original ones. So let me give you a chronology of the main monuments that I'm going to be looking at today. Most of these are in Cairo from the Fatimid period, starting at the Mosque of al-Athar, and continuing on with several Cairo monuments. The first one that is not in Egypt at the moment is the mimbar that used to be in the shrine at Asqalan in Palestine. It's now in the Maqam Ibrahim in Bethlehem, in the Khalil. And there's one in Damascus. Then all the others, until we get to the first Zangid monument, the first non-Fatimid monument, is in Damascus in 1154. We have a few more Fatimid ones, and then we come to the one that I showed you before, the Ayyubid one in Aleppo. So almost all of the early dated examples of the use of geometric ornamentation in Egypt and Syria are in fact from the Fatimid period. That's one important point to notice from the beginning. This is an old view of the interior of the Mosque of al-Athar in Cairo at a time when they were teaching in the traditional fashion with the sheikh with his back against a pillar and the students in a halqa around him. In the background, you can't really see them here. There are a number of windows, but I have some details of these to show you. The one on the right has a pattern that is mainly vegetal. And when Creswell studied these, he thought that the vegetal examples were probably the only original ones. But if we have a closer look at the photographs that he took, they have been restored since then, but I wanted you to show them in their earliest state possible. The patterns, in fact, aren't that complicated. So the one on top here is essentially a series of triangles adjacent to one another with little circles around the middle of each of the side of the triangles. The one at the bottom initially perhaps looks a little bit more complicated, but in fact at the center is a six-pointed star, and it's surrounded by intersecting 12-sided pentagons. So again, a fairly simple pattern overall that is based on a hexagonal underpinning. So the question we should ask ourselves here, is this pattern closer to, say, the one in Ibn Tulun that I showed you at the beginning? Or is it closer to the Ayyubid one with the star and polygon pattern? And I think there's no question that it has to be closer to the Tulunid example. So it would be much harder to ascribe this to an Ayyubid date than to a Fatimid date, so we can assume that this is original. And for some reason, this seems to have escaped notice in previous publications. Next, I'm going to show some other ones that previously haven't been commented on in the second famous Fatimid mosque in Cairo, the Mosque of al-Hakim, built just outside the walls of the old city originally. And we're going to be looking at some examples that are on, or at least I should say that used to be on these windows on the outside of the mosque. There's one in a window in the minaret. It's actually not this minaret, but the one from which the photograph was taken. And there is also the remains of some original decoration which were below the crenellations of the mosque. Now, these weren't published by Creswell in his monograph on the Muslim architecture of Egypt for some reason, but luckily he has a wonderful archive of his photographs in Cairo, at the American University in Cairo where I work. And so I was going through photographs just looking to see what was available, and I came across in fact, he did mention these in the text, that it had windows with geometric patterns, but he didn't illustrate them. But lo and behold, I was able to find these photographs of them in the text. So what sort of patterns do we have here? Again, very simple hexagonal ones. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Where you have a six-pointed star at the center, and it's surrounded by 6 hexagons in very simple rows. This one is a little bit more complicated, six-pointed star again, slightly irregular hexagons, but these repeat all the way up to the top of the composition. And there is a photograph of a third one, which was present in the collection. It was not so well preserved, unfortunately, but I had a wonderful student who was able to do this magnificent drawing for me, showing what the original pattern was like. And certainly in terms of visual density, this is, at first sight, a seemingly much more complex pattern than the others. Although here too, there is a six-pointed star occurring regularly at the center of the composition, and all of the other lines in the composition are parallel to the sides of this six-pointed star. So it does have this same basic hexagonal underpinning that the other compositions had. Just one other element that makes it even more interesting, I think, is the way in which the lines cross over and under one another. And the drawing, in fact, has mirrored the remains of the original very closely in this respect. So it's still an early but a wonderful example, I think, of advanced geometrical design. Creswell also published a photograph of this window in his book, The Muslim Architecture of Egypt, but the photograph that he published didn't have this window grille intact. Luckily, again, I was able to find in the archives in Cairo this photograph, which shows that the pattern was a very similar one to the window grilles that we have just looked at. This is the window grille that is in the stone minaret of the mosque, so it's a very different shape from the other ones. So another very simple, basically geometric pattern. And finally, in an older photograph, before the major restoration of the building that was done by the Bohras in the 1980s, there was crenellations around the top of the courtyard. Again, the major geometric figure is the six-pointed star, a much simpler one given the size that was available in this rather narrow horizontal strip for the patterning in the building. So these are some major examples, I think, of early Fatimid geometric pattern that have been ignored up until the present. There's another small example, but one perhaps worth noticing in this building. This is the Mashhad of al-Guyushi on the Muqattam Cliffs overlooking Cairo, dating from 1085. And we're going to be looking at some details inside the dome that you have here, which is in front of the mihrab inside the building. There's a very interesting seal of Solomon, the six-sided star that appears at the very apex of the dome. But what I want to look at is the background to this wonderful Quranic inscription that goes around the dome chamber just before the zone of transition. It has a lovely floriated Kufic inscription, but in the background there is another six-pointed star. There's a row of these, and each one of them is connected by a little leg, as it were, to the row that is above this and fills the space in between the top of the one below. So it's a very simple pattern, but again, it's an indication of the love, I think, that the Fatimids already had for geometric patterning. An immense step forward, as everybody has noticed, is in the mimbar that was made by Badr al-Gamali for the shrine of the head of Hussein at Asqalan in Palestine. Now, this was later transferred to the Maqam Ibrahim in Al-Khalil, near Jerusalem, which is where it stands today. That was, as you can see from the design of this part of it, later also restored by the Mamluks. But the mimbar that you see beside it is the work of Badr al-Gamali, who was the chief vizier of the Fatimids under the Caliph al-Mustansir. And it was in this period, in fact, that the role of the vizier became almost equivalent, if not even more important than that of the Fatimid Caliph. Badr al-Gamali was called in to put down a revolt in Egypt by the Zangid troops. And he was successful in doing this, but the Caliph paid a price. From now on, the vizierate was commensurate in power with that of the Caliph. And this is important because it's been argued sometimes that the patrons of some of these monuments with geometric ornamentation were only viziers, they're sub-imperial, but in fact, he was every bit as important as the Caliph. And here are some details of the ornamentation that you have on the sides of the mimbar, which has been represented as being a great step forward in terms of design. Here you have six-pointed stars also at the heart of the design. So here, for instance, it's on a fairly large scale, but it's surrounded also by regular hexagons at this point. It's even been suggested that the advance in geometric design here is so great that perhaps this could be later than the date which is actually written on the mimbar. But I don't think that this is likely to be the case. The details of the foliate decoration that we have within the geometric panels is still not very three-dimensional, such as one finds in some of the later Fatimid woodwork that I'm going to show you presently. And yeah, certainly all of the patterns that I've been looking at, these have been analyzed in detail by Bonner. And so this kind of hexagonal star with hexagons surrounding it, you can see in one of the variations here. And these all have the same geometrical underpinnings. The next dated example is one that is from Damascus, the Musalla al-Aidain. And it's one that admittedly has mostly foliate decoration, which is seen prominently in the Mashrabeya area that you have in the lower part. But there is still another significant element of geometric decoration within it. Not six-pointed stars this time, but almost the equivalent hexagons are repeated regularly in the design with other polygons surrounding them. Although, in fact, I suppose with the central hexagon here, this element you can also count as a six-pointed star. It's been restored at that point, clearly. This has a different geometrical underpinning, but it's one that is also very simple in style. This is the shrine of Kulsum in the Southern Cemetery in Cairo, dating from 1122. This is the only original Fatimid decoration that's left on the building within the mihrab. And the pattern is a very simple one of 8-sided stars with alternating with crosses down below. Next, chronologically, is one of the finest monuments of Fatimid Cairo, the Mosque of al-Akbar, the moonlit, dating from 1125. It has wonderful decoration in on the facade, a beautiful grill that is made of a Quranic inscription. At nighttime, if you see it, the light shines through this actually and makes it even more visible from the outside. It also has some extremely unusual and important carved stone decoration on the outside of the building. That includes a door and a grill with a lamp above it. The door supposedly could represent two interpretations. The Shia Hadith, which says that I am the kingdom of heaven and Ali is the gate, or the secular interpretation would be that it's related to the Sahib al-Bab. This was the title of the vizier at the time, the person who controlled access to the caliph. And in fact, this was built by a vizier, Mamun al-Bata'i. So it could refer to his office. But looking in detail at the grill that you have at the top left of the facade, this, by the way, also was deemed important for two possible interpretations, one religious, one secular. The religious one is that it could be a representation of a mihrab. That perhaps is not quite so likely because this is the first building in Cairo that shows a street axis that is at an angle to the Qibla. So it's not quite in the Qibla direction. The secular interpretation is that this represents the grill which was taken by someone who defected from the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad and brought with him a famous grill as a trophy, which was then erected in the Fatimid Palace, which was actually next door to the Mosque of al-Akbar, and the Caliph used to give appearances to the crowd from behind this grill. So that would be a reason for representing this on the facade. A very simple design again, a six-sided star surrounded by irregular hexagons. You can imagine this being extended in many directions. The original crenellation around the courtyard on the inside of the building no longer survives. But we're very lucky in that an English architect, James Wilde, visited Cairo in the 1840s and made some wonderful sketches, very detailed sketches of the monuments that he saw there. And this one, as you can see, is of the parapets, as he calls them, that used to exist around the Mosque of al-Akmar. So the lower part of it, in fact, with the central six-pointed star is exactly the same as we saw in the Mosque of al-Hakam. And the upper part as well, it's openwork or a grill, as James Wilde informs us. It doesn't look perhaps at first glance all that geometrical in form, but if you have a look at two other sketches that he did of the same monument, then the geometrical underpinnings in this lower drawing, if you match up, for instance, this triangle in the area below it with this area, you can see that the designs are very closely related. So here's another example of love of geometry in Fatimid ornamentation that has been ignored until now. This is, however, a much better known and a much more famous example of geometry in Fatimid art. This is the portable mihrab which came from the shrine of Sayyida Nafisa in Cairo. Now, it does have an inscription on it, but the inscription is Quranic and doesn't give a date or a patron. There were two major Fatimid restorations of the shrine, one in 1137, one in 1147. It's very likely that this must date from somewhere between those two dates. The central niche does have a geometric pattern, but here admittedly it's not as significant as the foliate decoration that is in the background. But what is very impressive is the star and polygon decoration that we have in the outer field of the mihrab. So at the top you have a six-pointed star, and the design of this, the way it steps outwards from the arch, looks a little bit arbitrary at first sight until you realize that if you go down, you have half six-pointed stars here, one here, one here, and so forth on both sides, which doesn't perhaps look very significant, but if you are able to visualize the connection, and I did this simply by putting the two slides together, you can see how the six-pointed star that is directly above the mihrab arch is mirrored all the way down this central axis. Now we have one here, one here, one here, and one further down as well. So they're relying on the viewer really to complete the pattern with their own minds. There's another very interesting pattern that occurs around about the same time in the Mosque of al-Athar. It was restored extensively by the Fatimid Caliph al-Hafiz in 1154, and he added a dome at the entrance to the clear story, the raised part of the roof that leads towards the original mihrab, which was under a dome here. And there's a grill between this dome and the inside of the mosque that I'm going to show you next. And this too is a very interesting pattern. It certainly looks a little bit more complicated than what we've been seeing, but here again, the basis is a fairly simple six-pointed star. It's surrounded by a hexafoil. So this outward curving pattern with six sides on it, echoing the six-pointed star in the middle. Now, chronologically at this time, we come to the first non-Fatimid example in the corpus that we're studying today, which is the Bimaristan of Nur ad-Din, the Zangid patron in Damascus. And this, it's true, also is quite an impressive one in terms of the complexity of the pattern. You can see that it has 6 pointed stars here, and it also has adjacent 5 pointed stars as well. So this is really a little bit more complicated than the Fatimid examples we've been using, but this is the first non-Fatimid one in our chronological series. And this is the analysis that Bonner has in his text of this particular pattern. So there is another magnificent portable mihrab in Cairo, which was done for another Fatimid shrine, that of Sayyida Ruqayya. And this one we can date a little bit more closely because the foundation inscription that you have at the top is in the name of the Caliph al-Amr, and it has to date from around the same period as the previous one, just about 1154. And here all of the main patterns on the mihrab are geometrical. Again, 6 pointed stars form the basis for the pattern, but they're composed in very different ways, as you can see. The one in the niche, for instance, has the star with these irregular pentagons surrounding it, but it's such that another 6 pointed star here, you can visualize it as the pentagons surrounding it and this one at the same time. So it's an interesting kind of double vision that you can see in this case. Here, like they see it in the Fisa mihrab, the earlier one, there's a single 6 pointed star at the top of the arch of the mihrab, which is the most prominent feature. But here too, you have the step inwards, which also reveals the same half star at regular intervals along each side. And here again, if I duplicate it, this feature perhaps becomes a little bit more obvious. So you have a 6 pointed star here, another one here, down here, so regularly all the way down. It invites you to complete it with your imagination, essentially. And, well, in fact, this is just to give you an example of how complicated mathematical analysis of the tessellation can be. This is the one that I showed you at the beginning, where he's describing exactly how, in mathematical terms, that one can define the pattern here. But it certainly is a very, well, as he says, unusual and highly inventive use of the 6 pointed star and the polygons that we have been looking at up until now. The back and sides of this portable mihrab, unlike the previous one, are also decorated with this variety of patterns that you can see. So this is the back, and these are the two sides that I have put together in the same photograph so that you can see the complete variety. And there's a nice mix, obviously, of geometrical and foliate patterns. So the sides, they have 3 rectangular patterns. These are almost all the same except for this one, which is a little bit more complicated. At the back, you have larger versions, and all of these, again, have 6 pointed stars at the basis for the composition. This is a slightly more complicated one. 6 pointed star at the center, but you have these inverted triangles forming an additional composition. So this is a detail of that one on the right-hand side. So here's an inverted triangle. Here's one that's the right way up, surrounding the central element, which makes it a little more advanced than some of the other ones. So this is one that Bonner also comments on in his analysis of the pattern. There are several similar ones, but it's quite similar to the one that you see on the right-hand side. In the small village of Qufs in Upper Egypt, the vizier as-Salat al-A'a rebuilt the mosque in 1155. Why did he do this? Well, he in fact had just been made the vizier at this point. Before that, he had been the governor of Khus in Upper Egypt. It was a very important town at that stage, much more important, say, than nearby Luxor is today. And what survives here is the earliest Fatimid mihrab that has been preserved. And it's a superb example of woodwork based again upon the hexagonal star. You can see it here, for instance, and here, surrounded by elongated polygons. So this design that you have on the right-hand side might be the closest in Bonner's analysis. And the general shot that you have there doesn't really show you just how magnificent the woodwork is here. You can see that in each of these geometric compartments you have these magnificently carved arabesques, and even the surface of the arabesques is in turn carved with more patterns. So you have this depth of detail on many different levels here. And even within this hexagon you have another six-pointed star. In fact, the designer of this seems to have reveled in producing as many variations as he wanted on geometric design. The overall one hasn't changed, but there are little parts of it where you can find a 5-pointed star, a 7-pointed star, an 8-pointed star, a 9-pointed star, an 11-pointed star, and a 14-pointed star. Not combined with polygons, but still it's just an example of how he was perhaps amusing himself and also making it visually much more interesting for us. This is another famous piece of Fatimid woodwork. It used to be controversial until Caroline Williams published some very cogent arguments in favor of dating it to the Fatimid period. It came from the shrine of al-Hussein, of course, a very important figure for Shia Islam. And 3 sides of it are decorated and the 4th is blank. The most likely explanation is that the 4th had an inscription in the name of the Fatimid founder, and the Ayyubids didn't like this on one of the major monuments and so had it removed. The main argument in favor of an Ayyubid date had been the fact that it has a lot of inscriptions in cursive as well as in Kufic, although Kufic certainly dominates the composition, as you can see. But in fact, there's no good reason to think that using cursive, thuluth or naskh in itself, is a reason for not dating it to the Fatimid period. We have many Fatimid textiles that use cursive. We have another piece of woodwork in the Mosque of as-Salat al-A'a in Cairo that uses cursive as well. And all of the other evidence suggests that this too is an important Fatimid piece. The design is also a very interesting one. Again, we're using hexagons mainly. If you look at this central design with the star in it, the 2 to either side, in fact, are basically the central one split in half. So these panels are on the sides of the cenotaph, and if you imagine these coming together, they would produce the same pattern that you have in the central panel on the front. And for this reason, I think we should also perhaps re-examine the case for some parts of the shrine of Sayyida Nafisa that were removed from the shrine and put in the Islamic Museum in Cairo, and were assumed to be Ayyubid simply because they have cursive inscriptions on them. This is one of them. It has fairly simple geometric patterns, but given the Fatimid restorations of the shrine in 1137 and 47, there's no good reason why this shouldn't be Fatimid. Another piece, this is a little bit more controversial because you have 2 contradictory elements here. You have an inscription at the top which mentions the name of some of the Fatimid Imams, and it even refers to al-Hussein as Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now, I don't think there's any Ayyubid patron that would ever have allowed that to remain on a building, although the Shahada that you have at the bottom is missing Ali Wali Allah, so again, that's unlikely to have been Fatimid. The most likely explanation, I think, is that this was an original Fatimid piece which perhaps had some parts of it replaced later by an Ayyubid patron. In terms of geometric design, it's also has some very simple ones, but again, it's one that perhaps we should reassign to the Fatimid rather than the Ayyubid period. Getting a little bit more complicated, towards the end of the Fatimid period, we have the doors of a Salat al-Aya, metal revetted doors. This is the earliest example that we have in Cairo. And here we have, for instance, we have now 6-pointed stars and 5-pointed stars. So it's a bit like, say, the pattern that we had on the Nuruddin Bimaristan in Damascus as well. And there's an overall picture of the door, the exterior of the door on the right-hand side, and a detail of the wooden patterns on the rear of the door. Now, these look fairly simple to me, although this is something that Bonner, in his book, in fact, compares to the exactly similar pattern that you have on the Aqsa Mimbar in Jerusalem. So he calls it an outstanding geometric pattern that is generated from this 4.8.8 underlying tessellation of squares and octagons. To my non-mathematical eye, this looks rather plain. And in fact, this might be an example of the disconnect that you have between a mathematician's view of geometric patterning and that of the layman. I mean, if you think it's difficult for us to analyze the pattern standing before them in modern times with perhaps the increased mathematical background that we might have, you can imagine how much more difficult it would have been for people at the time when these monuments were actually built. I mean, this is his analysis of the pattern. Again, it looks relatively simple to me. And that brings us then to a much more advanced use of geometric patterning, the one that we saw at the beginning in the Maqam Ibrahim, dating from the Ayyubid period, which uses to me what seemed to be an incredibly brilliant combination of 10, 11, and 12-pointed stars. But here again, look at how a mathematician views it. It contains areas where the pattern matrix is problematic, the crowding of the pattern lines at the centers of regions defined by the 11 and 12-pointed stars. To my mind, an earlier analysis by Hertzfeld of this, the almost unsolvable problem of a design based on groups of 11 and 12 and 10-pointed stars, the most complicated design ever produced by that branch of art. So there are definitely more than one way at looking at the difference in the development of these patterns. So going back then to the chronology that we have, it's been claimed that the art of geometric ornamentation trickled from Zangid and Ayyubid Syria into Egypt in Fatimid times. But in fact, if we look at the chronology that we have, with the now especially the very detailed examples that we have, even from the very earliest Fatimid mosques of Cairo, I think it's very clear that any trickling that went on must have gone in the opposite direction. So in terms of ideology, the idea that the Fatimids somehow were abhorrent or didn't want to use geometric design is certainly not borne out by the evidence. Thank you.